Well, it's pretty cold in here. Hopefully it will warm up. It's a bit smoky as well. And you can see my breath. So the Picos de Europa are a series of limestone peaks, part of the Cantabrian Mountains in northern Spain. They're very well known in Spain, but not so much elsewhere. So there are three main massifs to these mountains. There's the western and eastern massif and the central one. There is a route that has been devised called the Anillo de los Picos, the Ring of the Picos, or the Ring of the Peaks. And you can follow this kind of figure-of-8 route through the three massifs. Now, I didn't have time for that, so I just did the western and central ones, which I think are probably the most impressive peaks of the three. So I'm just going to run the video that I made. I made two videos, but I'll run through both of them and explain a little bit about the hike. And at the end, I'll show you the map and give you some information, practical information about how to get there and what to expect from the walk. Okay, let's play the video. So I started in this village called Posada de Valdeón. It's a beautiful little village. You go through this kind of nice gentle landscape to begin with, so you kind of ease yourself into the hike. You go through this beautiful deciduous woodland, just cloaking the hillsides. It's really beautiful. Eventually you do start to climb and you get up to this kind of pass. So this is the first place you can stay. Vegabaño is quite a nice spot. You can get a nice meal and breakfast, and there are beds. But I didn't actually stay there. I went on to a little hut further up the mountain, which I had all to myself. The downside of that is that little hut is very basic. It's just 4 walls and a roof, and it's full of mice and mouse droppings. I'll explain more about the refugios at the end of the video. There's a few things to know about them. So when you go up the mountain from Vegabaño through the woods, you're climbing up to about 1,600 meters, and on the way up you pass this fantastic oak tree. It's called the Roblon de Cuesta Fría. It's absolutely huge. You can't really see the scale of it in my video, but it's quite an impressive tree. It really stands out in the forest. I think it's hundreds of years old, and it's very tall. It's one of the tallest oak trees I've ever seen. Eventually you reach this tiny little hut, Frade, and it's got this clunky old iron door. It's not the most inviting place, to be honest with you. It's surrounded by stinging nettles, and the floor is covered in mouse poo, and it's got a tiny, tiny little window. It's got a fireplace, but there's nothing to burn nearby. There's no wood, really. There's a fountain outside for the cattle, but you can fill up from there. It's not just for the cattle. So when I got there, it was in the mist, it was in the clouds, it was quite atmospheric. And then when I woke up the next morning, the mist had cleared and I could see the mountains for the first time. You can really see here how they are limestone peaks. So from here you head up behind the refugio there to the skyline. And it's quite a steep climb. This takes you up from the refugio at 1,600 meters up to about, just looking at the map here, 2,100 and something meters. So this is the point where you first see the really high peaks. You reach this high ground, and straight ahead of you is this amazing limestone wall. You can usually see some climbers up there on the wall. So I stopped here for quite a while taking photos and filming, and the thumbnail for this video is actually taken here. And so far the trail is quite easy to follow, but from this point it starts to get a little bit trickier. You have to pay attention to where you're going. And we're heading now towards another refugio, unmanned hut. It's just left open. A bit like a Scottish bothy, but it's really tiny. It's only got room for about 4 people sleeping in there. But it's in this beautiful wild karst country. I didn't actually film the refugio because there were too many people hanging around. I didn't really want them in the shot, so I just carried on walking. I was desperate for water at this point. This was a running theme through my hike, trying to get water. I was carrying about 4 litres with me, but I was regularly running out, and there's nowhere to get water because it's limestone. It's very porous rock, and there are no streams, well, barely any streams. And I found a tiny little spring here, which was a bit of a godsend because I was dying of thirst. So fill up with water whenever you can, and make sure you've got plenty with you when you start. You need at least 4 litres, if not more. From this point it really gets quite hard to find the trail. There really isn't a trail. There's just animal paths like the chamois. So making sure you go the right way is paramount. But it's quite tricky because the landscape is very convoluted. There's lots of different little dips and valleys. So I was doing a lot of map checking. The paper maps aren't really that great. This is the Editorial Albina 1 to 25,000 map, and it's not great. The detail's not really good enough. So I was using a map app called Outdoor Active, which helped a bit because it pinpoints where you are. But even that was quite tricky. So because the trails aren't that well used, it's not that well trodden, but I did go the wrong way a couple of times and ended up having to climb up back onto the right route. Yeah, you have to pay attention a lot here, and it's really slow going. There's only a few kilometres to the next hut, but it took me hours. I think I was doing less than 1 kilometre an hour because the terrain is so rough. There was so much stopping and starting, checking I was on the right route. Eventually you do get across this difficult ground. It's very barren, very rocky. It's quite tough going, this section. In fact, I'd say it's probably the toughest section of the whole hike. But eventually you get down to easier ground where it's a bit more grassy, and you just drop down the valley towards the next refugio, and I stayed at this one. This one was great, and there was lots of nice people there who I met. A couple of Germans and some Swiss people, Spanish obviously. There's quite an international feel to the place. This refugio is called Vega Redonda, and it's run by a couple of guys. Well, it was the year I was there. I think they were the shepherds in that area, and they're quite eccentric but very hospitable. Just make sure you're on time for dinner because they do like punctuality. In the evening everyone gathered up on this little ridge just above the refugio for this amazing sunset. And I say it's amazing, but it's kind of unfortunate in a way because the sky was so red, but I later found out that the reason the sky was so red was because this is actually the smoke from the Canadian wildfires. So the smoke has travelled all the way across the North Atlantic and was shrouding northern Spain and parts of France. Pretty incredible. So that kind of spoiled the sunset a bit, knowing that that's why it was so red. Okay, day 3 from Vega Redonda to the next refugio, which is Vega de Ario. And on this section again, the route finding is really quite tricky. The first climb up to this point here isn't too bad, but beyond here it's not always clear which way to go. There's so many trails like made by the cattle and the chamois. It's not always clear which way to go. There's no signposting or anything. You'll see lots of vultures in this area, mostly griffon vultures. Again, there's no water really between the two refugios. I found one water trough towards the end of this section, which was for the cattle, but it was pretty dirty water, so I didn't take any of that. Quite a lot of up and down on this section. Again, really rough terrain, really scrapes away at your boots. But it's really, really beautiful. The wildflowers, the mountains, really lovely. So this section is 17 kilometers and it took me 5.5 hours, which is pretty slow. Because of the terrain and the route finding, it's quite tricky. So eventually you get to this refugio, Vega de Ario. I remember feeling very happy to get here. I was so hot, so thirsty, and I just filled up on eggs and water and other things. I made a really stupid mistake here. I hadn't brought enough cash with me, and the refugios don't take credit cards, so I only had about €5 on me, which was barely enough to buy a beer or some eggs. So I got a beer, and then I asked the hut warden if she'd kindly let me pay for my food when I got home. So I did a bank transfer when I got home, which was very kind of her. So yeah, camping outside the refugio was fine, but there was lots of donkeys and cows roaming about. I was a bit worried that they might chew my tent, but the hut warden reassured me that they wouldn't do that, and they didn't, so that was good. So that brings us to the end of my first Picos de Europa video. I've got 2 on here, so we'll go to the second one now. We'll keep going. So from Vega de Ario, you have to cross the Caras Gorge, which is one of the deepest, if not the deepest maybe, gorges in Spain. Yeah, it's very famous in Spain, but not so much outside. It's a spectacular kind of canyon which slices right through the Picos de Europa. And this day is really quite knee-jerking because you have to descend about 1,000 meters and then go back up the other side 1,000 meters. It was really hard. One thing I would recommend is maybe breaking this into 2 days. When you descend down into the gorge, you can walk north through the gorge to Poncebos, or south to Caín and Posada de Valdeón, and you can maybe stay there or get a taxi to one of the other villages. As I descended into the gorge, there was this fantastic cloud inversion, so there's all the fog in the gorge. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, the cloud rolls in from the Bay of Biscay, so you often get these cloud inversions where you've got all the fog in the valleys. Now, continuing down, you get to this stream, which is a real godsend. That was quite a nice, refreshing spot. And eventually you reach the Caras Gorge down at the bottom. There's lots of goats, but there are also lots of people. It's a very popular tourist route. People like to walk from one end of the gorge to the other. And it's a bit of a shock really to come across all these people in trainers and sandals walking up and down the gorge. One of the great things about it is the path is much easier. Having just clambered your way down the mountainside, you suddenly get to this really wide level path. So it's a bit of a joy to the feet to walk along there. It's an absolutely spectacular gorge. It's really amazing. I was pretty blown away by it actually. And then comes the really hard bit, heading up the other side. It's just relentlessly steep. It's about 1,000 meters straight up. I was so thirsty going up there. I carried about 4 liters of water with me that day, and by about halfway up that slope I'd run out and I was getting really thirsty. So yeah, make sure you take plenty of water, maybe take 5 liters if you can. So I headed up to about 1,500 meters and found this beautiful little camp spot on this ridge looking over the clouds and the mountains. So this is looking west back across where I've just come from. Wonderful spot. As I've said before, you're not allowed to camp below 1,500 meters. This was pretty much on the 1,500 meter contour, so I was quite happy to get there. I couldn't do another step really. And I got to enjoy this wonderful sunset across the clouds and the mountains. Just me, nobody else around. So day 5, headed off from my campsite. First part I was walking through the fog and it was quite hard to find the trail, but eventually you get to a wider trail, and on the map there's a couple of via ferratas marked where they put these iron chains on the rocks to help you over tricky sections. So I was a little bit nervous about what that was going to be like, but it was fine. And they weren't actually via ferrata, they were ropes. So there's these quite exposed sections where you have to scramble a bit, and they put these ropes there to help you along. It's not technically difficult, but you need a little bit of a head for heights. And once you pass that obstacle, you get to the refugio at Jus de los Cabrones. It's quite a small hut, and it's quite popular with cavers because there's a huge cave. I think it might be the deepest in Spain, I'm not sure. But it's just nearby, and yeah, caving is quite a popular sport in the Picos de Europa because of the limestone being porous rock. There's lots of caves. And then continuing on from there, I didn't stop at that refugio, I carried on, and it's quite rough going, but the path is fairly easy to follow here. It's a bit more defined. And towards the end of that day you get to another via ferrata. It's not too difficult. The only difficulty is if you've got a big rucksack, it kind of scrapes against the rocks because you're going down into a little chimney and it's a bit tight. But it's not too difficult, that one. And then you get to the most busy refugio. This is Urieu, which is right at the foot of the Naranjo de Bulnes, which is the most famous mountain in the Picos, and one of the most famous in Spain. It's a huge tower of rock that's very popular with climbers. So there's lots of climbers and hikers at this refugio. I camped outside here, and I bumped into some other hikers I'd met before on the trail. So that was nice, we all had a beer together. So day 6, this is another challenging day. I think I've said that about every day, but this one's particularly challenging. The traditional route is no longer recommended because there's a via ferrata that has kind of fallen into disrepair. So the hut warden suggested I go this other way, but even that was quite difficult. It's quite steep, a bit of scrambling to do, and yeah, it was pretty hairy in places. As you come up onto this ridge, you get a fantastic view of the Naranjo de Bulnes in the background. That's the peak that all the climbers flock towards. And then continuing on, you get to the ridge, the Orcados Rojos, and you have to cross over there to get to Cabaña Veronica. Once you're up on the ridge, it gets a bit easier. The ascent to the ridge is quite exhausting and challenging. I think in this shot here, actually, you can see the route I took. I came up onto the ridge behind me there and then traversed round. You can see how difficult the ground is, and eventually you get up onto the ridge. And then when you go down the other side, it's a bit awkward, but it's not as bad as what's come before. And you reach Cabaña Veronica, which is a tiny little hut. I think it's got room for 6 people, maybe. So you definitely need to book that one in advance. Lots of chamois. Watch out for them dislodging rocks. There's a number of occasions where I heard rocks falling and then saw the chamois with the culprits knocking them down on my route. From Cabaña Veronica, the first bit's a little bit tricky, finding your way across the rocks, but you head towards this pass and then it's fairly straightforward. Follow the path which traverses the mountainside, and you get to Refugio Collado Hermoso, which is in a spectacular spot on the edge of a cliff. Quite a precipitous location. So I camped on the ground here, on that grassy ground at the back. They've set aside a few little spots where you can put your tent. But this was the last night, really, and what a place to finish off. But even if you're camping, you can eat in the hut. I had dinner with 2 Spanish couples who didn't speak much English, so I got to practice my Spanish, which was fun. And in the evening, the hut warden suggested everyone go and watch the sunset from the ridge behind the hut. And that was a very good suggestion. One of the best views I've seen in a long time. We just had this magnificent view across the clouds, looking back towards where I'd started the walk. It was a nice way to round off the whole hike. And even the chamois were enjoying the view. So that's pretty much the end of the hike. The next day was just a few hours down, heading down back to Posada de Valdeón. So what I'll do now is I'll just show you the map. So, Western Europe. You can actually see the Picos from space. If you look there, that is the Picos de Europa, those little white dots. That's the limestone peaks. They're so prominent. We zoom in, there we go. Try and keep them in the center of the screen. So you can see the 3 massives, the western, eastern and the central. There is the route, the Picos, no, what's it called? The Anillo de los Picos, the ring of the peaks, which goes from Fuente de across to the eastern massif, around here, and then over there and back round. But you can do anything you want, really. There's all sorts of trails you can do. So I just did the western and the central massifs. So I start in Posada de Valdeón, and you go along a nice gentle lane to begin with, just to ease yourself into it. And it goes up this valley here. You can see all the wonderful beech woodland here. It's really lovely. And you go across a pass and get to Vega Baño, where you can stay there at Vega Baño, or do as I did and go up to Frade, which is the really basic refugio, where you'll just be spending the night with the mice, like I did, trying to stop them eating your food. So the advantage of going to Frade is you have a shorter day the next day. because the next day is quite challenging and slow. I was averaging about 1 kilometre an hour the next day, which takes you across here. You go up this gully and then across all this rough terrain to another very basic shelter, Refugio Vega Huerta. And then this next section to, let me see it up here, that's the next refugio. This is one of the more challenging sections. It's right up in the high mountains and it's really slow going and very hard navigation, trying to find the right route. At least I found it was. So that took me a long time getting through there. You have to come across here. It all looks a lot easier when you're looking from space, but when you're down on the ground it's a lot harder. The terrain's quite confusing. And you come through here, there's often a lot of snow in here, even in the summer. And then you come across here, all this is really complicated ground until you get to this valley going down to Vega Redonda. And you can't camp there because it's just below 1500 meters. So if you want to camp, you just have to camp a little bit further up the valley. I'll just zoom out again so we can get our bearings. And again, another tricky day navigation wise from there to Vega de Arrio, which is over there. You kind of traverse the mid slopes of the mountains here, and there's a lot of up and down, and the trail disappears and reappears, and it's not always clear which way to go. I did find the Outdoor Active Map app was pretty useful here for pinpointing exactly where I was, so I knew I wasn't veering off in the wrong direction too much. And it's also worth to take an old school compass just to make sure you're going in the right direction. From Vega to Arrio, this is the up and down day. You go down into the Carras Gorge, so it's a very steep descent. It doesn't really show it on here, just how steep it is. And then you walk up the Carras Gorge a bit and go up the canal, as they call them, a gully. I think you come up here, and I camped up here. And the next refugio is over here at Jus de los Cabrones. I had intended to go there, but I was so knackered by the time I got here that I just camped on the 1500 meter contour. And then the next day headed round to the refugio, but kept going over more rough terrain. But it's a bit easier to navigate here. The path was a bit clearer, so that wasn't so difficult. And then you get down to here, you go past the steep section with the chains, sorry, the iron rungs. Let's zoom in a little bit. That's the Refugio Urielu there. And then if I zoom out, you'll see that there is the ridge we have to go over the next day from Urielu to Cabana Veronica, which doesn't seem to be marked. So this bit's really tricky. You can see it quite clearly there. So the hut's down there, Urielu. The normal route is this way, but they don't recommend you go that way anymore because it's too dangerous. So I went up onto this ridge here, which I was told was the best route, but it was still really quite challenging. And then over here to Cabana Veronica, that might be it there. Oh, that might be it there. So you go there, and then quite tricky navigating the first bit, but then it gets easier and you get to a mountain pass. I think it must be here. Yeah, about there. And then you kind of traverse across. There's a couple of little passes to go over, but it's generally just a straight traverse to this green area here, which is where Collado Hermoso is. That's the most spectacular spot for a refugio, in my opinion. Perched on a cliff edge. And then from there, it's just down, 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 back to Posada de Valdeón. You come down this valley here, and there's another little via ferrata right at the bottom. It's quite a big drop. There's a ledge on a cliff with a chain. If you don't have a head for heights, you won't like that one. But it's not difficult. It's just a bit high up. And then you just follow the lane to Posada de Valdeón and you've completed a circuit, which is about 80 kilometers when I added it up, which I was a bit disappointed with because it felt like a lot more than that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Final thing I'll do is just go through some practicalities. So what shall I tell you? Well, how to get there. If you're coming from the UK, there's a direct flight from Stansted to Oviedo with Ryanair. EasyJet and others fly to Bilbao and Santander from the UK and other parts of Europe. And if you're coming from the USA, there is one direct flight, and it's from New York to Bilbao with United Airlines. But if you're coming from elsewhere in the US, you'll have to change in London or Amsterdam or Madrid. There's also ferries from Ireland and the UK, from Rosslare, Portsmouth and Plymouth to Santander and Bilbao. Once you're in Spain, that's where the fun begins, because it's actually quite hard to get to the Picos de Europa by public transport. There are buses from Oviedo to Posada de Valdeón, but they're few and far between, and you have to change, I can't remember where, but you have to change somewhere, and it takes about 4 hours. There are also buses from Bilbao and Santander which take about 15 hours, but they don't really get you close to the trailhead, so you end up having to get a taxi at the end. The only other option is to hire a car, which is what I did, which is kind of annoying because you end up obviously leaving the car sitting still for 6 days. But it actually didn't work out much more expensive than getting a bus, and it's a lot more convenient. So I did that. Where to sleep? Well, you can wild camp. I did a little bit of that, but you're only allowed to camp above 1500 meters, which you are most of the time above 1500 meters. But I would recommend just staying in the refugios because they're well spaced, well organized. You can get breakfast, lunch and dinner there. You get to meet some nice people, fellow hikers. So there is a website called Reserva Refugios where you can book the huts beforehand, which you have to do really. They get booked up well in advance. So definitely go there. I'll put a link in the description for that. And make sure you take plenty of cash, which is not what I did. I didn't take enough and got caught out. So the refugios don't take debit or credit cards. You need to take plenty of cash with you to cover your whole hike. So check how much things cost. The refugios are about 15 euros, I think, but then there's breakfast, lunch and dinner on top, and beer, if you like that kind of thing. Things to worry about. Let's talk about things to worry about. There are wild boar in the woods, but I wouldn't actually worry about them too much. Some people think they're dangerous, but I actually saw some in the woods above Posada de Valdeón, and they just scarpered. They shot off at a rate of knots as soon as they saw me, so I wouldn't worry too much about the boar. There are bears in northern Spain, but again, they're not like North American bears. They're not as dangerous. I suppose there's always a very, very small risk that you might get in trouble, but they're not known to be aggressive. They're very shy, and there aren't many in the Picos anyway. Most of them are further west in Somiedo National Park, so I wouldn't worry about the bears. In the afternoon, thunderstorms can build up, so it's best to get most of your hiking done before or shortly after lunchtime. So set off early if you can. Falling rocks are a bit of a danger. I was warned about falling rocks, and sure enough, there's a few occasions where they came tumbling down the mountainside towards me, and it's usually because the chamois have dislodged them. The chamois are up on the cliffs, knocking the rocks down onto your head, so yeah, watch out for that. Dehydration can be a problem. As I've mentioned, I was carrying 4 litres of water, and that wasn't really enough, because it can be quite hot, quite sunny, and there aren't many streams because of the limestone. It's very porous rock and the water just drains through it, so there's very few places where you can top up your water bottle, so you have to kind of carry it with you from the start of the day. Just make sure you've got enough. The only other thing is the terrain's pretty rough, of course, so mind you, don't twist your ankles. Just be careful in some of the more difficult sections where the navigation's quite awkward. Make sure you're going in the right direction. I wouldn't recommend this route really if you're a beginner. It's quite challenging in places. One other thing to mention are the sheepdogs. The shepherds keep their sheepdogs up on the vegas, the meadows up in the high ground in the summer, and they leave them there with these sheepdogs that kind of bark at anything that comes near the sheep. So they're pretty big, intimidating animals, but they're well trained. If you just give the sheep and the dog a wide berth, you should be fine. Don't walk towards the sheep. And yeah, well, that's it really. The Picos de Europa. I lived in Spain quite a few years ago. I lived on the east coast of Spain and used to spend a lot of time in the Pyrenees, and I'd always wanted to go to the Picos but never got round to it. And now that I don't live in Spain, I've managed to get there, so hopefully I'll get back. It's a really wonderful area to explore, and yeah, I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for watching.